Hey, everybody, welcome back to Archaeology After Dark. I'm, of course, your host, Daniel Rhodes. My guest today is Dr. Sven Oostman. Sven, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure, Daniel. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone taking the time to view at least this far.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about today's topic.
All right, first thing I need to acknowledge country. So, Nala Kadich Wajuk, Murt Ken Kadak, Nija Buja. So I come to you from Perth, or that's the European name, Boulevard and Burlong are the proper names in Wajak language. So that's the traditional group that lives here. Australia has a great many Indigenous Australians, though they only make up 3% of the population in colonized Australia. There are well over 400 or 500 language groups. And as you can see from the map over there, this is just in Perth. There are several different language groups and clan groups within the Noongar group. I'm on Wajak land, but we're adjacent to Balladong land and so on. And similarly, I acknowledge all the Indigenous and traditional peoples who'd be viewing this presentation. For myself, I'm an archaeologist and heritage specialist, South African by birth, and have worked there half my life in museum context, half my professional life, and came to Australia in 2013 permanently, though I've been working across what we call the top end. Let me get the right arm. We do teach coordination. So that top end of Australia, the tropical north, where there's a great deal of rock art and other archaeology and some of the early sites. I've been working there since 1996. I had actually studied in the US for my PhD, and I'm now looking at both Southern Africa and Northern Australia as archaeology, and be happy to chat about Australian archaeology today.
Okay, so where would you like to start as far as, explaining how archaeology is studied in Australia?
So I thought what might be useful is if I do a little sort of potted history of how how we understand the archaeology of Australia, at least within an archaeological frame, acknowledging that Indigenous people have other narratives. And then I'll go into some issues, some of the sort of hot topics around climate change and heritage, around rock art, around the dark emu debate that is big and current at the moment, as well as some of the issues we're facing that are sometimes similar to a lot of the issues in the US. But Australia doesn't generally get a great deal of attention in some parts of the world. It probably has a pretty, I know it has a pretty low visibility in the US. It's not Africa, where we have really old sites and all humanity originated, at least within an evolutionary paradigm, and then moved out into the world. And most people are sort of unaware, other than snippets here and there, about its rock art heritage, for example. So I thought I'd just give a kind of overview of how we understand it archaeologically. So within the archaeological frame is all humanity in its various forms. The genus Homo originates in Africa and then moves out into the world. Current research is very exciting, as most people know, in that we're constantly finding new exemplars of our genus and even other genuses and species. And clearly it's a very complex past with multiple forms of humanity living. In fact, today is rather an interesting time in which we're the only exemplar of our species, possibly the only time in our genus's history this has happened. Nonetheless, anatomically and cognitively modern humans move out of Africa, and then they come to what is today Australia, although in the past it would have been called Sahul. It was a much larger land mass as ocean levels were lower at various stages, for example. And they came from the larger landmass called Sunda, basically island Southeast Asia and the bits of mainland Southeast Asia. And it's thought how exactly humanity moves, and maps like the one behind us we always have to take with a pinch of salt, because you have lineage extinction. Some people move and then move back. Some lineages get lost, kind of thing. The classic case is in the Australian Aboriginal genome. We find evidence of both Neanderthals and the Denisovans. So the Denisovans are slightly off the map here, just up at the top. We don't quite know how they got into the genome just yet. But when we look at so DNA, people forget it's a very neat technique, but it's quite new and it has a number of assumptions, such as a generation is 30 years old and so forth. And so you need other sources of evidence to test and corroborate what's happening in the DNA. So obviously, as archaeologists, we look to the archaeology. And when we come to Australia, up here in what is today the Northern Territory, we have a site called Mudjabebe. And the basal layers at Mudjabebe have been dated through OSL dating and other corroborating dates with accelerated mass spectrometry carbon-14 to about 65,000 years ago. So though it's controversial in some respects, some people think the initial human colonization of Australia was much more recent, as in sort of 55,000 years or so ago. So that's one of the debates we have. But if we accept the 65,000 as the start of humanity in Australia, bearing in mind that this is what we found on land, a great deal of what would have been land at that time and earlier is now underwater. And indeed, colleagues of mine like Joe MacDonald working in the Pilbara in Northwest Australia, are busy excavating and finding terrestrial sites, but that are now underwater. So it's a really neat project in which you do predictive modeling of what's the landforms underwater, where are people likely to have lived, and they're finding stone tools, fish traps and other stone structures, for example. So it's a kind of watch that space. This has happened in Europe a lot. They have over 3,000 sites underwater, or land sites that are now underwater that they've investigated. But the oceans there and the currents are much less extreme than the tropical north of Australia. We've got these currents, cyclones, tornadoes, all of those different kinds of things that make this work quite difficult. But that's why the rewards are very exciting. So they're likely to be older sites that are underwater. So people sort of think there might have been a land bridge, or sorry, I should rephrase that. There wasn't a land bridge, but sometimes there's a misperception that there was. There would always have been at least 90 kilometers of open ocean between island Southeast Asia and Australia. So you get things like, so if I do some share screen, I think probably this one, I can give you an idea of how the land mass was. So looking at that slide over there, this is just some work we've done dating a 17,000-year-old macropod, 2-meter long, call it a kangaroo. So here in the map, here, if you can see the arrow, you see Australia, and the Kimberley, Australia, an area I work a lot, is marked in red. And then in this larger map, you have the current coastline here. So Columbaroo is a town currently essentially on the current coast. But these other bits of green show the bits of Australia that would have been, or Sahul as it would have been there, that would have been land, that would have been exposed with lower ocean levels because of glaciation, for example. And so in this little series along the bottom, you can see the coastline today, 12,000 years ago, 17,000 years ago, 22,000 years ago. So it's quite mind-blowing in a lot of ways. The site we worked at to find this kangaroo, to put it in context, right now it's about 80 kilometers from the coast in a straight line distance. But when it was painted, it would have been about 400 kilometers away. Not only that, at 17,000 years ago, you're just coming out of the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago. So it was more arid, and often the idea is that people were just surviving in these very harsh conditions. But they sort of forget, 17,000 years is a hell of a long time for a painting to survive, a rock painting to survive. At the same time, you've had people living on this landscape for almost 40,000 or maybe more years at least. And they would have adapted very well to the area. People forget that to get pigment for 2 meters of painting, you're going to have to travel, in this case, probably 200 or 300 kilometers to get it, mix it all together, make this painting. And this is one of over 1,300 sites we found in this area since 2013, for example. So there's an enormous number of sites. People aren't just surviving, they're thriving. So that's just an idea of the ocean level stuff. Let me just stop the screen share.
One thing I thought was interesting about the rock kangaroo depiction is 17,000 years, the kangaroo doesn't really look like it's changed that much. It looks, similar to how the kangaroo looks now.
Yeah, so yeah, so we have all sorts of there's one of the big debates in Australian archaeology. Sort of, I'm going off script now, but I'm very happy to do that. Is that we had megafauna here, these large animals, big birds like Genyornis, Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, Diprotodon, big hulking kind of creature that were here before humans came. And then one of the big debates is, well, their extinction, was it caused by humans? Was it caused by natural factors? Was it caused by some combination of these? And the jury is kind of out on this. It's not decided exactly what the effect of humans would be. For example, when you look at the middens of living sites where people are, and you look at the fauna that are there are all kinds of fauna, including all sorts of different kinds of kangaroos, some of which are now extinct, some of which were huge, for example. But you don't really find the megafauna itself. The megafauna seems not to be there. So that's a kind of, that's one of the mysteries that work still has to be done on. That kangaroo, for example, technically a macropod, because you get euros, wallabies, all sorts of things, is, then why would someone paint it? It's painted nearly life size. As with many rock arts throughout the world, there's a lot of attention to detail, and you could potentially identify it to species level, for example, and cross-reference it where possible with excavated materials of the same age. So it's remarkable that it's lasted 17,000 years, and as you say, it's recognizably a kangaroo. And when we work always with traditional owners, when we go with them in the field, they're very often able to identify specific species that are in the rock art, whether it's painted or engraved. And that's one of the benefits of collaborative fieldwork with Indigenous partners. That reminds me then to say, it's a very interesting conversation as archaeologists when we say our Aboriginal people's ancestors came here 60, 70, maybe it's 80,000 years ago, moved very quickly through the country. You'll see in the background behind me, you've got Mungo here at 44,000. So it's the earliest known cremation burial with a bunch of ochre currently known. And that people have moved through the whole landmass within a few thousand years. But this shouldn't be surprising, and neither should the ocean crossing of 90 kilometers. After all, they've come from the mainland through island Southeast Asia. And these are humans exactly the same as you and I. This is only 60, 80,000 years ago. So, none of those capabilities is remarkable in any way. However, Aboriginal people are generally very accommodating, like to talk sort of origin stories, and had experience of this in Southern Africa as well, is people say that evolution thing is like, we've got no problem with Africa. Africa's all good and well, but we didn't come from Africa. We came from here, from Australia. So they reject the evolutionary paradigm that people came out of Africa, traveled in some form through what is today Asia, and then landed in Australia. And so that's a challenge to us as archaeologists, is how do you deal with that? And my way to deal with it is, as an anthropologically trained archaeologist, I find that account of origin interesting, is that people have that account. Myself, when people say, do you believe in evolution? I say, of course I don't believe in evolution. It's not an article of faith. It's a scientific theory, and it's a very good one, so good that it should probably be called a law. But if evidence comes up that that's not valid, well, I have to go with that as a scientist. But that's not an attack on someone's origin narrative. So when you have a conversation where you say, oh, okay, that's your origin narrative, here's my origin narrative, you sort of set up a conversation. And Australia has, over the last few decades, a very good reputation for working well with Indigenous people. When you look at it anthropologically, Aboriginality as an identity does come from Australia. The genetic signature might indicate something else, but certainly the cultural and social and every other identity indicates that people came from and developed in Australia with distinctive languages, lots of distinctive kinds of archaeologies, rock arts, all of those kinds of things. And, who's going to argue over sort of 60, 80,000 years, I would say. So there's one of those things. Perhaps what I could move on, so that's the sort of potted history. Obviously, people then stay in very lots of landscapes from the very tropical north through to the arid interior, through down to Tasmania. So people often forget about Tasmania, which was also part of the mainland until about 11,000 years ago, and then ocean level rise cut it off from the mainland. It was pretty chilly in Tasmania and would have been in the past as well. And people then develop their distinctive languages and archaeological signatures, or what we try and identify through archaeological signatures. So it's a very diverse continent in which to work, and it's huge. So there's still a great deal more work to be done. Then the interesting thing is then contact, the whole thing of contact archaeology, which would probably be, there would be a lot of similarities with North America. Indeed, a lot of our contact archaeology draws theory from the classic North American theorists, Dietz and others. Before Europeans came, so 1788 is credited as the kind of first time Europeans set foot on Australia and colonize stroke invade Australia. And there's a very interesting initiative from the University of New South Wales by Lyndall Lorine and colleagues that maps massacres. It's quite a challenging map. Actually, let me find that for you. So Lyndall Lorine and partners embarked on an exercise essentially in truth-telling, part of this is to bring justice to people and just to make known these periods of history. They, as I said, they can be very challenging for people, but we do need to know about them. Right, I've got the map up, so I'm going to screen. Let me go back to the screen share. If I could, there we go. So here you have it. So obviously, there's a big debate right now in Australian archaeology. There's actually, as of yesterday, there's a forum piece around the word contact, and is that the right word to use? Is it too politically lame? Is it accurate? All of these different kinds of things. Anyway, you have this map in front of you over here, and you can slide back from 1776, sorry, first contact, through to 1928, actually a site in the area I work, the Forest River Massacre. And as you move the slider, it then sort of shows the distribution of the different kinds of massacres. It's a very scholarly work. You can hover over a piece and you can see, okay, Fitzroy River killings in the West River Kimberley, Aboriginal people stole property from Europeans, or they wouldn't necessarily call it stealing. So there were 14, between 9 and 20 Aboriginal people died and no colonizers died. If you want to read a bit more, then it gives you some more detail on that. So we're into that phase, you know, as the world goes through Me Too, BLM, BIPOC, all of those kinds of things. Australia certainly is getting into it, but you can imagine with a 3% indigenous population, it'd be a similar sort of situation in the United States. It's easy to ignore sometimes. So archaeology is as a memory there. To me, good archaeology is democratic. It shows the full spectrum of human endeavor, from the tragic, the despicable, to the noble and the wonderful kind of thing. So, but you know, Europeans weren't the be all or end all. Actually, the point I was trying to make is that before Europeans came here, Aboriginal people in the tropical north were in regular contact with what we call Macassans, people from what is today Makassar in Indonesia. They would come down, they would trade for pearl and crocus shell, other objects, and particularly beche de mer, the sea cucumber or trepang that was used for various medicinal purposes. And then they would intermarry. Aboriginal people would travel back to Makassar and other way around. So it's an interesting study in contrasts as to how contact might work. In one case, it's pretty even and consensual. In another case, it's, you know, debatable as to whether it's contact or an invasion, for example. So and one of the challenges we face today is to have more Aboriginal archaeologists. So Australian archaeology is pretty organized. We have a survey of the discipline every 5 years or so. Colleagues at JCU, Sean Olm, Geraldine Mate and others survey the archaeologists in the country. The survey is usually roughly 1,000 or so people. or 600 to 1,000 people. And it has a look at gender. So there's a worrying 25% gap in pay between male and female archaeologists, according to the last survey just out this year. And only 1.3% of archaeologists identify as Aboriginal, but 70% of Australian archaeologists identify Indigenous archaeology as their primary focus. So it's very useful to have these surveys to see where the kind of problem areas are. It's all very well us maybe pointing fingers about massacres and things like that, but we have to look inward as well as to where our kind of weaknesses and growth areas are. So that's one of the sort of things that are happening, and just jump in any time. Another thing I thought might be useful for people to know about, in addition to the standard archaeology, the excavations, the paleo-environmental reconstructions, the underwater sites, the excavation archaeology, the islandization, the living in arid areas. You can do a bunch of things here. We have a large international contingent of researchers here. And hopefully now the travel restrictions have eased, that will pick up again. But there are a number of quite contemporary debates. I quite like when archaeology fits with society today. And so, for example, one of these relates to, you may or may not have heard about no, I don't want to, I was going to share screen, sorry. I can only do one thing at a time. Let me choose a slightly more in focus background to get to the dark emu issue. So I'll move out of your way there. So a few years ago, this book was published by a man called Bruce Pascoe. So Bruce Pascoe has Aboriginal and European heritage. And you can see it's called Dark Seeds, Agriculture or Accident. So one of for a long time, the stereotype in Australia of Aboriginal Australians was, until the time of contact/invasion with Europeans, they were hunter-gatherers. They used the landscape in a classic hunter-gatherer way. It was structured, people moved with the seasons and all of those kinds of things, but nonetheless, they weren't farmers or anything like that. Pascoe and a few years before him, an historian called Bill Gamage, who published a book called The Greatest Estate, came along and said, hang on a minute, these people aren't just living on the landscape and taking bits and pieces as do classic hunter-gatherers. They're actively manipulating the landscape. And Gamage, for example, starts with colonial records, European records, that point to the burning practices of Aboriginal Australians, saying that people do what would today be called low-intensity patch burns. So they burn small areas of country. What this does is keep the fuel load low, so you don't have huge catastrophic burns. But in some cases, like the Mardu in the Central Desert, they burn in such a way that it increases the habitat for goanna, their main food source. And so they manipulate the environment to stimulate plant and animal species so that they can then harvest those. So it's not agriculture as such in that case, but it's a very active manipulation of the environment. And with excavations, you can start picking out the areas where humans come and the ashfall from controlled burnings increases, for example. Pascoe goes a step further and also uses early settlers' accounts, colonial accounts, as well as the archaeology, pointing out, for example, that with plants like yams, for example, here near Perth, George Gray, one of the travelers, talks about not fields of yams, but all of these holes where people, what they do is they harvest naturally occurring yams, but they'll do things like break off the vegetative top and replant it and then move on. Pascoe finds other cases where people will do a bit of weeding, redirect water to a naturally occurring stand of plant resources, through to creating stone structures in which to grow at least some kinds of plants. There are then other examples such as Budgebim, the eel traps down in Victoria. So these recently got UNESCO World Heritage Site status. It's an extensive network of stone channels where people were farming eels on a large industrial scale. So this really sort of upsets the apple cart in a good way about hunter-gathererness and people's relationship with country. We've done research up in the Kimberley on plant painting. So the Kimberley has more plant paintings than any other rock art tradition in the world that we know of anyway. The question is, why is it there? Very often people will have Rock arts will have animals and geometrics and these kinds of things. And long story short is we find compelling evidence for plants, for ecoscaping, what we call ecoscaping, what sometimes has been called domiculture, other words for it. So it's not necessarily agriculture as such, it's actually more complex. It's about varying intensities of relationships people have with plants and indeed animals. And as the climate changes, because climate change in Australia over the last few thousand years, 10,000 years, 20,000 years, and so on, has often been extreme. And so you need to be nimble and agile and be able to adapt to that quickly. Anyway, and it's not just as resources. We find in the rock art, people have plants, they're wearing plant material culture, and sometimes their body changes into plant-like forms, suggesting plants are an important part of ritual, of identity, of symbolic behavior, in addition to subsistence. And so there's a huge debate raging at the moment between Pascoe, archaeologists, anthropologists, civil society, which is good. You know, for me, I think Pascoe and Gamage, you know, I think they're right. In some cases, they might overstate things, but I think it's useful to have this public debate that shows Aboriginal people weren't just hunter-gatherers, because there are very immediate political consequences if you say someone was just a hunter-gatherer and they were just lightly on the landscape when it comes to, for example, land claims, contemporary land claims, the notions of ownership and stewardship of land. So this is an interesting one. I'll just, on that, and this has stimulated research on things like, I'll do a bit of screen share here, among ourselves. So for example, we've got to ask the question, is the nature-culture divide at all sort of useful? And there's the cover of Gamage's book, The Biggest Estate on Earth, How Aborigines Made Australia, for example. So we might want to look at that nature-culture divide that we have. In terms of climate change, you know, we've got to look at this as a rock art site inside. This is when I first realized climate change was an issue about 20 years ago, when an out-of-control bushfire damaged a rock art site in Southern Africa that we then rehabilitated. And the same thing happened just last year here in Australia with the very intense fires that we've had. I'm sure people in California and elsewhere can relate. So how do we research this? So there's a good body of theory in terms of how archaeology is contributing to understanding climate change, but more importantly, what can we do about it? So Aboriginal Australians have these healthy country plans in which they don't have a binary of nature and culture, but they do acknowledge that there are aspects of natural and cultural health that you have to look out for on country. But by doing a field trip, for example, we go out together and we go to a rock art site and we do a controlled burn, we've taken care of its natural health. We go to a dugong increase site and just make sure it's all clean and tidy. We've taken care of the cultural health of a natural resource. The project I'm involved with Balngara Aboriginal community and the Kimberley Land Council, Aboriginal Corporation, sorry, the community as well, is how to use fire to promote heritage management. So not seeing it not just as a threat. Obviously fire can be a very major threat to all sorts of heritage, whether they're colonial buildings or ancient rock art sites. If we flip that narrative around and say, if we burn in the right way, perhaps we could then ensure the continued health of sites. The fact that that kangaroo painting has lasted 17,000 years shows that it's pretty tough and that the indigenous fire management was effective. It didn't burn down, for example. And this kind of work not only protects the site, it has a whole lot of other social and political benefits as well. It gets people out on country. So Australia is big, as the US is big, and it's often very expensive to get out somewhere. You have to have a vehicle, money for petrol, money for food, all of those kinds of things. When we go out, we also pay traditional owners for their time and their expertise and the keeping us culturally safe, for example. So it's in our occupational health and safety plans. We make sure there's a cultural safety aspect to keep everyone safe in that way. And we do all sorts of work with rangers, with Aboriginal rangers who are, getting rid of poison plants, who are looking after country, who are mapping rock art sites, all of those kinds of things. So it's a very effective way to do that. And it has health benefits for people, particularly the old people who are back home. They can't get out onto country, but they know the knowledge that country is being cared for makes them feel better. It makes them feel less stressed. The people who are out on country we're eating bush tucker. It's a healthy lifestyle, so it's really quite good. We've just got to start convincing government agencies like what would be the equivalent of the US Park Service, that all of this is an essential part of the regular maintenance of country, because there's quite a lot of misinformation out there, which we'd probably like to stop. Yeah, so I've sort of rattled on for sort of 25 minutes or so. Daniel, you direct me. What would you like me to talk about or go into a little bit more?
So one question, somebody who I was talking to about doing this episode was repatriation. So say you find something that is of Aboriginal origin, do you return it to the Aboriginal group? I wanted to say tribe. I know that's the term we use here. I know that's not culturally a universal term.
Yeah, so thank you there. I've just seen that in my notes now, and that's a question we always have. So yes, just going back to nomenclature, tribes aren't used that much, groups, clans. Sometimes people use them. Interestingly, the word indigenous here isn't always, sometimes people prefer indigenous, sometimes they prefer Aboriginal. I mean, it's interesting, in Africa and Meso and South America, most people reject the term indigenous because of the sort of politics of marginality it's associated with. So obviously always we're careful with words and call people by the names they prefer to be called, usually their language group or those kinds of things. Repatriation is a major issue. So for a long time, obviously, Aboriginal people didn't have the vote in Australia. Until the 1950s, here in Perth, where I am, they had to have a permit to enter the city centre, and that permit was given by a man, or an office called Protector of Aborigines, a man called A.O. Neville, who to this day is referred to as Neville the Devil, not in a humorous way, by Aboriginal people who at that stage were seen essentially as wards of the state, as children of nature, and couldn't look after themselves, that typical sort of colonial patronizing form of racism. From early on, from the get-go, the early explorers and travelers, European explorers and travelers, would collect all sorts of things, what to them were specimens. That they could be bark paintings, they could be handicrafts, they could be stone tools, and human remains. So the human remains weren't humanized at all. They were seen as specimens in terms of that race-based science that was practiced in the 17th, 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries, where you'd be measuring skulls. So in a previous life as curator of archaeology at Iziko Museum in Cape Town, Iziko South African Museum, we had to do an audit of our collection to see what had been taken from where. There's a huge collection, 1,500 individuals, people, human remains, some of whom had been excavated with permits, etc. Whether that was ethical, it was certainly legal, is another question. But a large percentage, maybe 20% of people who had been grave robbed, who'd been stolen, and then who'd been traded all over the world. So I can't talk very much about it because it's an ongoing, this particular case is ongoing. But for example, well, actually, I'll just talk more generally, is that Aboriginal material, culture, and people, as in their human remains, went all over the world into collections. There was a well-established colonial circuit. You know, there are things like people often don't know that Thor Heyerdahl, the man of the Kontiki and Ra expeditions, who as a child I thought was wonderful, did in fact steal skulls from Polynesia and sold these on the market. There was a sale for these. Sometimes people were murdered for their remains. It's a terrible, terrible history and legacy, and it will take us many, many decades, probably centuries, to rehumanize those remains, to return those remains and objects. In some cases, I'll get to that in a bit, but essentially what happens is if someone comes across an artifact or a person in the form of human remains who they think originates in Australia, then the first port of call is to get hold of, there is the Office of Premier and Cabinet. That's how seriously this is taken. It's a federal responsibility under the Office of Premier and Cabinet. There's a repatriation unit. Cressida Ford and others work very hard in that to identify where Australian objects and human remains are and get those returned, working with people who are first willing to return them. So there are often issues where museums in particular say, oh, but if we repatriate one artifact or one set of human remains, we set a precedent, and this could open the door for all sorts of repatriations, is their fear. To which our response is simply, well, so what? You're essentially in possession of stolen goods. You shouldn't have them. And indeed, it's not just simply a case of returning. That often is the case. But very often Aboriginal partners and communities, when they're contacted, will often say something like, we don't have the capacity yet to curate those artifacts. Could you look after them for us until we do have that capacity? And then there are all sorts of interesting things that are being done behind the scenes, not in a secret way, but just in the architecture, to, for example, transfer ownership and intellectual property back to that group. So, for example, a museum that has Australian artifacts that it wants to display, it can't just display them, it has to get in contact with that group and negotiate how such a display might work, for example. Human remains are obviously a very sensitive case. In many cases, you have only the skulls of people that were traded, so the postcranial remains, we don't even know where those are. There's an interesting catch-22 in some cases. In many cases, the collectors of these human remains, because they thought they were specimens, not humans, they would simply provide provenance to a state level. They'd say it comes from Western Australia, South Australia, the Northern Territory. So there are many, many Aboriginal groups in all of those areas. Who do you give it back to? Now, we do have technologies in archaeology, genetics, looking at isotopes, doing OSL, radiocarbon dating. Sometimes they're associated material culture. It can be sand in the endocast that we can characterize. So we could do those tests and narrow down the provenance. The problem is you have to ask permission from the relevant group before you do those tests. But until you do those tests, you can't narrow it down. That said, the current generation, the younger generation of Aboriginal Australians is very interested in the technology that we have and very interested in co-developing and co-designing projects in which they have rights of veto in order to investigate and understand processes of repatriation and who someone should go back to. And they're also very interested in the digital world. How about making 3D scans, models, immersive domes, and those kinds of things, so that the physical object or the remains have another kind of life. So some things are secret and sacred, and that's restricted to the group and is not for anyone else. But lots of other things Aboriginal people would like to share with the world. They quite like the notion of something digital, a much more sophisticated understanding of digital products, I think, than often we do. The digital product, if you did a rock painting, for example, so we call it a rock painting. For many people, it's an actual being that's resting there on the rock. So if you just had a photo of that rock painting, that could be disrespectful. We always have to ask for what we call image permissions. But if you had like a kind of 3D super duper scan, often people just take their phones into the field and record it themselves. And then that appears on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook and TikTok videos and all of those kinds of things, and is taken over by Aboriginal people. But anyway, so that's a very long way of saying repatriation is taken very seriously. It has a specific unit that looks after it, and then at state level, there are designated repositories, particularly for human remains, but other artifacts as well. And eventually, we'd probably like to get all those people back to Australia. The important thing is the humanizing of them, and what people don't realize is it's not just the physical human remains, the bones, and those kinds of things. It's rehumanizing him, it's giving power back to the community over that person, but it's also all the data around that person. In a museum context, there'll be things like accession registered, photographs, measurements, the history of that person, what's happened to them, were they stored in a box on a shelf, were they on display, all of those kinds of things. So it's a complex and long process, and there's really no way of hurrying it. It often represents a traumatic history, and so it's appropriate that it takes quite a long time to resolve as people come to terms with what was done and with what they are going to do. So like that Mungo burial, Mungo that was requested by the descendant communities for Lady Mungo and Mungo Man to be repatriated, which happened in the late 1990s, 1998 from memory, but they were only reburied a few years ago in 2018 as people thought through the best way to do it. Should they allow scientific access or not? All of those different kinds of things. So yeah, long story short is repatriation is taken pretty seriously. It's currently, I will add there, is that, you know, it all sounds marvelous, it all sounds good, and things are trucking along, and they are. Nonetheless, is that, you know, there are always dips along the way. So currently, actually yesterday in Western Australia, a new Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act was passed. It sounds like a good thing, but in our, and I'm talking as an archaeologist now, in our considered opinion and our professional association, the Australian Association of Archaeologists and Australian Association of Consulting Archaeologists, think this is a very bad law. Essentially, it facilitates mining to take place and puts an unnatural burden on Aboriginal communities and corporations to manage heritage. Lots of protests from Aboriginal groups, from archaeologists, anthropologists and such like, but it's just been rammed through. In Western Australia, we currently have a Labor, it's not actually Labor at all, it's a very centrist, even slightly right government who's just pushed through this law. We in fact have 3 heritage legislations for the state, which unfortunately often fall along racial lines. The Heritage Act looks after the colonial period, so it doesn't exclude Aboriginal people, but it tends to favour colonial heritage, and the Aboriginal now Cultural Heritage Act, formerly the Aboriginal Heritage Act, looks after Aboriginal heritage. And you know, ideally down the track we should probably have one act, but because the 2 acts, for example, have different fines if you do a wrong thing under the act, and they're not the same. So it's implying one heritage is worth more than another. But there have been very few prosecutions. So in terms of the permissions mines asked to put their mine in, often over very significant cultural estates, very significant, acknowledging that mining and its royalties pay for heritage work as well, and that many mines work in responsible ways, but many do not. And so of the last little while, of the last decade or so, there've been just under 500 applications for what's known as Section 18 permit. None have been refused. They've always just been rubber stamped and gone ahead. So that's not the kind of balance you want to look at. And you will have seen in the news, hopefully in the USA, the Juukan Gorge Disaster, where a 43,000-year-old site was blown up. It's a very spectacular in a bad way of blowing up that site and the landscape around it, causing enormous damage to people around it, so cultural damage. It did result in Rio Tinto's CEO resigning and shareholders saying that's not acceptable. The problem with that is that Rio Tinto in that case didn't do anything illegal or wrong. It had one of these Section 18 permits, which allows it to blow up a site. But under the old Act and under the new Act as well, Aboriginal people cannot appeal a decision on their heritage. The mine or the proponent can. So, you know, there's the sort of imbalance that we have. So there's still, Australia in many ways is still in a very colonial state. And it's with an Indigenous minority, it's often difficult to raise heritage issues in sort of meaningful ways that empower people. So, you know, lest I sort of sound as though Australian archaeology is all wonderful and great, I think there are a lot of good things that have been done, but we face significant challenges, both social ones, political ones, never mind things like climate change, where all sorts of things kind of threaten people and heritage. So there's a lot of work to be done, but you know, it's interesting work, it's work that matters, it's work that's collaborative, it's work generally with interesting and nice people, which is why I do the job. But we're not going to be short of issues anytime soon.
Well, that being said, I think that's going to just about wrap us up for this episode. Any last minute advice you want to throw out to people who might see this?
So, well, you know, borders open. They're open in Western Australia on it's the 6th of February. You know, do come visit us. You're very welcome to contact me on any aspect of archaeology. The Australian Archaeological Association has a good website. They've got things like the Australian Archaeological, or you probably can't see that, Skills Passport, where you can get a whole lot of skills ticked off and things. Australia is a good place to study. It's a good place to work. And anyway, you've got to travel. You've got to do something with your life, eh? So, you know, make us part of your travels.
Absolutely. Australia is on my list for when the world starts turning again.
Right. Well, we'd be happy to host you, Daniel. Thank you.
And thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And I hope our
Yeah.
audience got a lot out of this. It was really great.
All right.